Tommy Tuesday, let's go!
Today we're going to be reading Golden Phoenix chapter 12 and 13. I'm on the wrong chapter. Shall we just jump right into a lore recap?
Yes, and as considering I did terribly last time, this is your turn.
Okay, so last chapter we got a little it's quiet uptown moment. Here, let me look up. Yeah. So we discovered that Kristen has given up her physical form to become a crow to watch over Tommy. And they're getting ready for Theseus's memorial. And then we're introduced to Tommy. He's in a tower locked away with Dream and George. Tabbo's been trying to find him and do research and all this biz. Rambu is like officially like Ender Prince man boy. And then whoa.
You know what? I agree. Get snapped in there.
I'm getting lost in the sauce, man. Yeah. Oh, Phil spills the beans. He spills the beans to poor Wibbler. And then Wibbler suit he runs away. He's away.
Like, you ho.
He's like, I hate you. And like Anakin Skywalker, I hate you. Except Philza didn't chop off his arm and his legs, so...
Man, that would have been funny. What?
Yeah. So Wilbur's gone. Techno's still chilling in the palace. Philza is probably feeling a lot of guilt right now. Get the lore music on.
Oh, yeah.
Because the most happiest music is playing right now, and that's not allowed on these streams. Chapter 12. Radio static. Trigger warning for implied/referenced self-harm at the end of the chapter. Nothing graphic, just bruising. Tubbo, I know. I can't possibly be that comfortable to nap on, Rambu chuckled as he brushed his fingers through his best friend's hair. The two were still sitting on the floor in Prince Wilbur's room, who still hadn't come back from going to speak to the Emperor. Shh. Your bony knees are the perfect headrest, Tubbo mumbled, eliciting another laugh from the Enderman dragon whatever. He usually just referred to himself as an Enderman. It was just easier. Yeah, well, my legs are beginning to lose feeling, and as much as I enjoy being used as a pillow, we're going to be late if you don't wake up, Rambu said, and heard the boy sigh before sitting up. The Enderman snorted at the sight of Tubbo's mussed curls that had flattened on one side of his head. The fuck are you laughing at? I've seen you break new hairbrushes before because of your bedhead, Tubbo teased, pushing the boy away.
Rambu rolled his eyes and ignored Tubbo's protest when he began using his fingers to fix his hair. Are you feeling any better? Yeah, I needed that power nap. Thanks, bossman. Tubbo exhaled and then stood to his feet. He took a moment to brush out the wrinkles in his suit and then extended a hand to Rambu, pulling the lanky teen to his feet. Tubbo extended his arms out and asked, How do I look? I don't have dried snot stuck to my face, do I? First off, ew. Second off, your eyes are still a bit red, but they should clear up by the time we get to the Great Hall.
Oh. Rambu, dear, you were supposed to tell me how pretty I am. You're lacking in the romance department today, Tubbo joked as he failed to properly bat his eyelids at the Enderman. Rambu simply gave him an amused expression and leaned forward towards him. Apologies, I wasn't aware that my goal was to woo my research partner. Tubbo snickered as he replied, No wonder you're failing at it. Keep it up and we'll wind up with a divorce at 16. Rambu gasped dramatically and placed his hand over his heart. Tubbo, you married me? Why didn't you tell me? I would have asked my siblings to come to our platonic wedding.
Oh, crimes. Could you imagine my father walking me down the aisle? I think we should get married just so I could see that. That is, if the Chancellor doesn't throw me in the ocean for trying to marry his son. The brunette shook his head, laughing, and agreed. Yep, that's a valid fear. Although, I don't know. I think I could see you getting his blessing after a decade or two. Baby steps first, though. Maybe take me out on a date before we tie the knot. Rambu barked out a laugh. What? The hundreds of hours we spend together poring over books in the library don't count? I thought that fireplace was rather romantic.
Ah, yes, because looking for new leads on the man that kidnapped my childhood best friend is so romantic. Remind me to break out the candlesticks and grape juice next time, Tubbo said offhandedly, and then paled once the words registered. Rambu stiffened at the words, and Tubbo's face fell. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. sorry. He put his face in his hands and the room was deathly quiet for a long moment until Tubbo felt Rambu press a hand to his back comfortingly. Everyone fought that night to save Theseus, Tubbo whispered into his palms, and Rambu's heart ached at the words. He wanted to argue but at that moment Tubbo sat back up and said, "But no, not me. I fell asleep and woke up to the sound of him screaming. My father woke up with me and told me to hide under Phil's desk. I stayed under that desk for over an hour, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. I wasn't thinking about Theseus. I was only thinking about how scared I was that whatever monster was out there would come for me next."
And then, when it was over, the screams finally stopped. The door opened, and I'll never forget the sadness in my father's voice when he told me it was safe to come out. Tubbo leaned over into Rambu's side, and the Enderling wrapped an arm around him. "There was nothing you could have done, Tubbo. We were children. You know what he did to His Majesty, the princes, and to your father. You did right thing by listening to your dad." Rambu could feel Tubbo's tears stinging against his skin, but he ignored it.
Oh my gosh, my heart. I was supposed to be in that room with him that night, but he kept fucking kicking me in his sleep like an ass. Tubbo chuckled tearfully, and then frowned. So I got up and went to my dad, and I never saw him again. I'm glad you did. He could have killed you in your sleep and snuck off with him without waking anyone up. If you hadn't left the room, it's possible we would have never known who took him. Tubbo wanted to argue so badly, but he knew the cycle. He went through it every year. The endless cycle of blame that everyone who had been there that night felt. If he continued to blame himself, then he would never be able to move on. He knew it. Rambu knew it. They had this conversation too many times to count.
So for once, Tubbo let it drop. There was a knock at the door, and the two boys pulled away from one another to see Technoblade peering his head in. The prince's eyes locked with Rambu, and Tubbo saw something flit over his expression for a moment before the man composed himself and walked into the room. "Where's Wilbur?" he voiced, and Tubbo shrugged. "He went to go get His Majesty about 20 minutes ago and never came back. Assume he's still with him?" Techno nodded, his eyes glued to the floor. There was something else bothering him, and Tubbo furrowed his brow.
"Are you alright, Techno?" Tubbo asked. "You seem off. Did something happen?" "It's merely a coincidence of the date, Tubbs. I'll be fine." Techno brushed off quickly and then sputtered, I'll go find Will. You two should head to the Great Hall. I'm sure Schlatt is wondering where you are." Before he could respond, the prince had already fled the room, leaving Rambu and Tubbo staring at each other with a perplexed expression.
"You know, I can see you hiding under there, Limo Pequeño." The dark-haired man mused to himself as he set a roast that was freshly out of the oven and ready to be carved. He was in a secluded area of the kitchen, away from the hustle and bustle of the normal staff, who were all working on food for Theseus's memorial. Being able to work by himself from time to time was just a perk of being the head chef for the palace. Quackity's eyes flitted downwards, and he smiled to himself when a pair of bright green eyes framed by thick, square glasses peered back at him. The 8-year-old frowned back. "How did you know? I was being so quiet." He bent down a bit so he could fondly ruffle the boy's strawberry blonde hair. He then replied, "I could see your shoes sticking out from under the table, Charlie. You weren't exactly hidden."
Charlie hopped up from underneath the table and hoisted himself up on top of it. He made sure to keep himself a good distance away from the roast his guardian was carving for what he assumed was the royal family's lunch after their memorial. "Aren't you supposed to be helping Nikki right now with pastries?" Quackity asked, not looking up from his work. Charlie nodded. "I did for a while. Then Mr. Jack said he'd help me with the rest, and he told me to go play." The man let out a hum. And did you? There are plenty of kids who play ball in the alleyway outside the gate."
The boy fiddled with his hands and let his head drop. "They don't want to play with me. They said I was too stupid to figure out the rules of the game." Quackity felt his wings tense behind him as anger swirled inside his chest. He quickly put down his carving knife and wiped his hands off with a rag. The man then rested his hands on his ward's shoulders, forcing the boy to look at him. His voice was soft as he spoke. "You're not stupid, Charlie. You're a very smart kid. One of the smartest kids I've ever met. Fuck what those little shits said outside." Charlie sniffled and his eyes filled with tears. Quackity's heart hurt at the sight as he continued. They only said that because they're jealous of you. You have food, a home, and an education that they can only ever dream of having. They only said it to hurt you. You're not stupid, Charlie.
The blonde nodded and Quackity circled his arms around him and pulled him into a hug. Forget those brats. You stay right here with me, okay? You can help me make lunch. I'll even let you use the stovetop. Charlie pulled away and took off his glasses so he could wipe his eyes. The boy gave Quackity a weak smile and nodded. Can I help make the stew? Quackity smiled. Of course you can, kid. Suddenly the two noticed the entire kitchen had gone completely quiet, and Quackity quirked an eyebrow curiously. He lifted Charlie from the table and set him down on the floor. Quackity smiled when the child instinctively grabbed his hand as they made their way to the main area of the kitchen where the rest of his staff were.
Quackity raised his eyebrows at the sight of Prince Wilbur standing at the threshold of the door, searching the crowd of people for him. Your Highness? Quackity called out, and Wilbur's eyes shot over to his. The look he gave Quackity was distressed, and his brown eyes widened as he motioned him over. Prince entered the secluded area of the kitchen, and Quackity turned back to his staff, instructing them to continue with their tasks. Charlie pulled the sliding panel shut, allowing his guardian and the prince privacy. He then quickly ducked back underneath the table, partially out of sight. Quackity chuckled to the boy, but didn't say anything more, instead looking to his childhood friend, who appeared to be rather shell-shocked. His eyes flitted downward, and he noticed Wilbur was carrying a suspicious-looking knapsack in his arms, with what Quackity could only assume were clothes and a few other items.
What the hell happened? Well? Oi, Your Highness! Quackity waved a hand in front of his face, trying to pull him out of his own head. Wilbur, look at me, man. Take a deep breath, okay? Quackity gently took hold of the prince's hands, letting the bag in his arms drop to their feet. He squeezed them in his own a few times, attempting to spark a reaction. Still nothing. Finally, he looked down at Charlie beneath the table, and then eyed the large empty cooking pot resting on one of the counters. Charlie looked over at it and then back to Quackity and nodded, realizing what he was asking. The boy crawled out from under the table, then whacked the pot off the counter, letting it clatter loudly against the tiled floor.
Wilbur practically jumped 2 feet off the ground, his wing nearly spreading out involuntarily from the start. Earth to His Highness, do we have contact? Fucking primes, Wilbur swore, eyeing the child in the corner who was suddenly trying to look as innocent as possible. Scared the hell out of me, Q. Quackity laughed. Sorry, man, you weren't responding and you had this blank look in your eyes, so you worried me.
Wilbur looked down and nervously scratched the back of his neck before stammering. Sorry about that. I've got a lot on my mind. Quackity nodded. He imagined anyone's head would be clouded on a day like this. Anything you need to talk about? I doubt you're here for the roast, he said, trying to cut through the tension a bit. It worked, and Wilbur's distressed expression softened a bit to allow a smile.
Alas, I did not come for your cooking, Q. Wilbur's eyes flitted upward to meet his own. I'm here because I need your help. Quackity shifted his weight onto one leg and crossed his arms. Why do I get the feeling you're about to go do something stupid? Aren't you supposed to be with your family right now, Your Highness? Wilbur's eyes hardened a bit, but Quackity could tell the anger wasn't directed at him. Quackity, we all know that Theseus' memorial is for the kingdom, not his family. And you want to what? Ditch the ceremony? Quackity asked incredulously. Your father will send half the guard out searching for you within the hour.
His friend looked down for a moment, unsure for a moment if he should say what he was thinking. Wilbur caught it almost immediately, like he always did. Speak your mind, Q. We're standing on equal ground as we always have been. You soft-hearted motherfucker. Sometimes Quackity forgot about his best friend's origins. Wilbur had come from nothing, just as he did. From day one, Wilbur had never regarded himself as more important than Quackity. Other people did, of course, but not him. To Wilbur, Quackity's opinion was worth its weight in gold, no matter how harsh it might be. Today of all days is not the day to be running off without notice, Wilbur. You know that. I know that you do, Quackity said firmly, and then added, Why are you trying to hurt your family? This isn't like you.
Wilbur looked taken aback by how accurate Quackity had read him and quickly replied with, I'm not... He grumbled and then barked back. How the hell did you gather all that? I've known you for a long time, Will. I can tell when you're being self-destructive, Quackity answered nonchalantly, and Wilbur lightly scoffed. He was about to answer when he suddenly remembered there was a kid in the room. Wilbur looked at Charlie, who was staring at them from underneath the table, and smiled. Hey kid, if you go bug Nikki for a cupcake, I'll give you 15 silver.
Charlie's eyes lit up at the promise of money, and in a split second, he had sprinted from the room and out of sight. Nice to know I've taught him well, Quackity laughed, and Wilbur didn't miss the fondness in his eyes. He fished out the money from his pocket and handed it to the man to give to Charlie later. You should formally adopt him, you know. He thinks the world of you, Q, Wilbur suggested, and Quackity paused, briefly distracted by the thought of being Charlie's legal father figure. Then he remembered that this wasn't the time to be thinking about that. Don't change the subject. This is still about you, Wilbur.
Brunette sighed, looking very uncomfortable at that moment, his eyes locked on the floor. Quackity was about to drop the issue when Wilbur finally spoke. Selfish. I know it is, but right now I don't really give a damn. Wilbur looked up at Quackity and said coldly, I'm in pain. I'm grieving, and I'm so fucking angry at Phil right now. I can't tell you why. Not now. Not while I'm this upset. It would just be too much. His eyes were pleading as he spoke, and Quackity could feel his resolve crumbling like dust. I can't go to the memorial, and I can't be anywhere near this palace right now. Please, Q. Please, just trust me and let me go. Kitchen back door is the only exit that I won't be stopped at. The man implored, and Quackity stared at Wilbur for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I swear, if I get fired because of you, I will hunt you down myself, Quackity threatened, half-jokingly. Wilbur's expression lit up like the sun, and Quackity smiled, a warm feeling blossoming in his chest.
Then just as quickly as his joy had appeared, it quickly morphed into mischief. Wilbur grinned impishly and leaned over a bit towards him. Promise? If Quackity could have rolled his eyes any farther back, he would have. Idiot, Quackity replied, giving out a dry laugh. Go on. You can get changed in my room. Take my crossbow with you and try not to get yourself killed. Wilbur placed his hand over his heart playfully and said, Aw, you do care.
Trust me, I'm caring less and less by the second, Quackity joked, and then suddenly looked down at the ground as he added, but, don't do anything stupid, okay? Wilbur's eyes softened as he smiled. I'll be safe, Q. Promise. He turned to leave, but before he could, Quackity added, I won't keep this as a secret from Techno if he asks, so... The man nodded. His back turned to him and said, I know you won't. I'm not asking you to. I'll see you later, Quackity.
And then he was gone, and Quackity wondered if he had made the right decision. Gay, homosexual, gay.
I love them. I love them.
Yes.
I'm so happy. That was great. Okay. Ooh. There we go. We're done.
That's it. Thank you. TNT duo.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Now it's time to be sad. Sorry, Kit.
Okay.
Theseus's memorial ceremony was, as Wilbur had put it one year, poetically depressing. And to be honest, Techno couldn't agree more. The event of Theseus's memorial extended to his birthday, which had been only a few days after he'd been kidnapped. The kingdom would normally spend the next few days decorating L'Manberg for his birthday, while his family mourned. Yeah, Theseus's 6th birthday had been one memory he was glad Chat had blocked out for him. He didn't want to remember just how loud his father's cries for his wife and son had been from his bedroom.
He didn't want to remember the way Tebo had apparently hid under his father's bed, too scared to even breathe. He didn't want to remember how his twin had sat in the rocking chair by Theseus' bed for hours unmoving, endlessly staring at the emerald necklace in his hand. And according to his father, Technoblade had spent hours entirely motionless in the library atop one of the bookshelves that were pressed up against one of the walls beneath a window, at least until Phil had climbed up and brought him down. Even now, 11 years later, Technoblade still felt that overwhelming urge to run, to forget what had happened that night and just hide himself away from the world.
Can we take a minute to appreciate Emmy's art? Oh my god.
Art is so good.
Oh
my god.
Oh my gosh. He's sad. He's holding the necklace. Talk about under the bed. Oh my gosh.
No.
I am unwell. I am... Oh my god. Oh my god. As he entered the great hall, that's exactly what he wished he'd done. It was the same as it was every year. filled with the important people who probably had only met Theseus once but had never spoken to him. Then there were the people like the Dukes, Mumbo Jumbo, Grian, and now Scar, who hadn't known Theseus but knew his fellow friends and had met him the night he disappeared. They had come every year since and had always managed to bring a small smile to his face. Techno's eyes flitted over the crowd as he searched over a sea of unfamiliar faces until finally he found the Chancellor and his father speaking to one another in the corner of the room near one of the several banquet tables scattered across the room for people to sit at. There was one table that sat on a large platform in the back of the room to keep the Emperor and his family safely separated from the crowd of people. It was a precaution that Phil loved to ignore, choosing instead to speak to his people directly, much to Puffy and Sam's dismay.
Lat never strayed too far from his father's side for this very reason, thankfully. Techno scanned the room again and found where Tubbo and Rambu were in the crowd, and then frowned. Where is Wilbur? He found Sapnap and Foolish along with a woman with long dark brown hair and a kind face. He had never met her personally, but he was pretty sure her name was Tina. There was another person standing next to her, a brunette whose back was turned to him. For a moment he thought he'd found his brother, but then the man turned and he grimaced. It was only Carl, a traveler from the south that had arrived a few years back, met Sapnap, and hadn't left his side since. He remembered for a time Sapnap, Carl, and Quackity had been quite close, but around a year ago, something in their relationship changed. Now the only interactions Techno had seen between the three were dark glares exchanged when they thought the prince wasn't looking.
Wilbur's relationship with Sapnap had also taken a hit around that time, and Techno had just assumed he decided to side with Quackity. It was a bit sad to see, considering his twin had known Sapnap since the first few weeks after their arrival. Techno had never been close to the man, and he never asked Quackity or Wilbur what had happened. It wasn't really his business anyway. Your Highness, a voice from his right called, causing him to jolt a bit as he was torn from his thoughts. He turned and relaxed when he saw it was only Connor, a knight who had been working at the palace for a couple years. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you, but the Emperor is asking for you, he said, and Techno nodded and allowed the man to escort him through the crowd. As they got close, he saw his father look up at him from his conversation with the Chancellor and gave him a strange smile. It was at that exact moment that he had felt his connection with his chat snap like a violin string that had been wound too tightly. The prince stumbled suddenly, feeling violently off balance without the constant hum of activity that he'd grown used to, and eventually relied upon him to keep himself grounded that he'd grown used to and eventually relied upon to keep himself grounded in reality.
It wasn't normal. It felt like he'd suddenly lost a limb. He felt detached. He felt like he was floating aimlessly through a sea of people. A hand gripped tightly on his shoulder, keeping him from stumbling to the ground as Connor expertly maneuvered the prince through the crowd. Techno shuddered. It felt like every eye in the room was on him. In reality, only a handful of people had been close by when he nearly collapsed. He'd have to remember to thank Connor later for getting him through the room and over to his father without creating a scene.
His ears were ringing loudly as he felt Connor hand him over to the Emperor and Schlatt, who quickly helped him through one of the side doors that led to a private sitting area. Chad? Techno rasped as they sat him on one of the couches. Where are you? Techno? Phil called, and the prince felt a hand against his cheek as he struggled to focus back on reality. It's so quiet, I can't hear them. Techno bit his tongue to keep his voice from wobbling.
Something was wrong. He tried to focus on the last thing he heard Chat muttered before cutting out. The only thing he could think of was that a few of them had called out for him to find Wilbur. Then he looked up at Phil and they went silent. Techno took a deep breath and let himself calm down. He searched around his head for a moment and let out a sigh of relief when he found the link still intact. Chat wasn't gone. They'd shut him out. Highness? He heard Schlatt call, and then heard his father tell him to go and fetch Bad.
It was at that moment his head snapped up and he protested. No, don't. I'm fine. Techno winced, feeling his voice was suddenly 10 times louder than it should be. You don't seem fine, Highness, Schlatt argued, but didn't move to leave. Techno shook his head. He wouldn't know what to do anyway. It just startled me is all. They aren't normally the ones to shut me out. I just wasn't expecting it. He wasn't lying. It was frustrating, but he blocked Chat out before, so he could think many times in the past. He could handle being alone in his brain, Though a warning would have been nice.
Are you sure, son? Phil asked, looking extremely concerned, and Techno nodded. I'm fine. I need to go drag Wilbur out of the library anyway. Techno lied. He knew he wouldn't find him in there. If Wilbur had in fact ditched the ceremony, which would be extremely hypocritical of him given their earlier conversation, then he was almost positive the man was with Quackity. He looked up at Phil and his expression furrowed when he saw a pained look on his face at the mention of his twin. Unless there's a reason I shouldn't? Techno asked warily, and Phil stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. No. Go find Will. I'm sure he needs to talk to you. Just try to bring him around at some point. I wouldn't be surprised, however, if he just wanted to be left alone. Now Techno was really confused. Had his father and brother had an argument in the hour before Theseus's memorial? What could have possibly been said to him that caused Wilbur to miss his little brother's memorial?
Am I missing something? Techno turned to Schlatt, who looked equally confused. I'm sure your brother will fill you in. I can't have this conversation again right now. And not when there are at least 200 people in the room next to us. Just promise me you'll come to see me afterward. I'm sure we will have a lot to discuss. Technoblade simply stared at him with a perplexed expression, but didn't argue. Instead, he nodded and attempted to stand back to his feet. He felt a little less off balance, but the lack of his chat was rather disorienting. He really hoped they'd be back sooner rather than later. As he turned to leave, he heard Phil call. Techno?
Yeah, Dad? He answered, his hand on the handle of the door. His father gave him a tired smile. I love you, son, and I'm sorry. Techno didn't know how to react to that, and instead just replied, Yeah, I love you too. I'll see you tonight. With that, he quickly hurried out of the room.
As soon as the prince had left, Schlatt turned to the Emperor and asked, You told Wilbur about the visions, didn't you? Phil let his shoulders slump, but he didn't deny it. I couldn't lie to him anymore. Not when he kept telling me that I'd done all I could to save him. Schlatt pinched the bridge of his nose with his forefinger and his thumb, and spoke as bluntly as he could. I won't lie, Phil. This was not the time to tell them about that. Especially not today. I know, Phil admitted, and Schlatt scoffed as he moved to sit in the armchair next to the couch.
I can't imagine what exactly is going through their heads, especially Wilbur's, but I'm guessing he didn't react well. He told me that he hated me. Not that I blame him.
Oh my God.
Phil said mournfully as he stared at the dark oak floorboards of the room. He didn't mean that, and you know it. You might be pretty fucking pissed off right now, but neither of them could ever hate you. And especially not over a lie you told to protect them. It might take a while, but they'll learn to accept it. Phil nodded and straightened in his seat. I hope you're right. I really do. Your Majesty, I'm always right. Schlatt grinned.
Phil let out a weak laugh. If only that were true. He called him Dad. He said, I love you. I
can't do this anymore.
Oh, well, you're going to have to, bestie. It's Tommy time.
It.
It's Tommy time.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Tommy, at some point tonight, you're going to have to look me in the eye. You can't stay mad at me forever. Dream chimed as he took another bite of his dinner. The late afternoon sun shone brightly through the window, illuminating Tommy's golden hair even more than usual. The teen didn't respond to Dream's attempt to elicit, yes, a response from him. He instead looked down mournfully at the chicken on his plate and sighed. Dream always forgets that I don't eat meat.
Oh. Boy stabbed his fork into one of the potatoes rather violently and left it there. He heard Dream sigh irritably as he finished his meal and set his dishes in the sink for Tommy to do later. Fine. Act that way. You're still gonna have to put up with me for the rest of the night, however, so get used to it. I'll be gone in the morning anyway. Tommy perked up at that and tried to sound as jaded as he could as he asked, Where are you going?
He heard Dream laugh. So you do care about me. Good to know. Tommy felt a pang in his chest at the sentence. Dream simply ignored the hurt on the blonde's face. George and I will be on a trip for the next few days. Just another job. Should only be gone about 3 days. Tommy tried to mentally tally the amount of food in the tower. He might have to skip a meal or two. Damn. He quickly stuffed another potato in his mouth. Relax, kid. I stocked the pantry. You'll be fine. All you have to do is ask me to get groceries, Tommy. It's your own fault if they run out.
Right. Sorry, Tommy mumbled, suddenly really missing Crow. He hoped she had gotten her dinner by now. Twiddling the fork in his hand, he skewered another potato, then winced as he felt a sharp pain in his spine from his wings shifting around. He looked over at his brother, who was no longer paying attention to him, and thought, fuck it. You can only get into so much more trouble. Dream? He called, and the green-eyed man quirked his head up from the sword he was polishing. Can I take my wings out for a bit? They're really hurting me right now. I won't have them out for long, just long enough for me to fix them up a bit.
Dream sighed, and Tommy could tell by the annoyed expression on his face he was about to tell him no, when suddenly his eyes unexpectedly softened, and he said, Sure, but make it quick and shut the doors and windows. Stay upstairs, and try not to get feathers everywhere, would you? Tommy shoved another potato in his mouth, and then shot up from his chair, grinning. I won't! Thank you! He could hear Dream chuckle as the boy raced upstairs and into his room. He was careful not to let the door slam and gently closed it. The moment it closed, he felt a smile drop from his face and breathed out a sigh of relief. As he worked quickly to shut every window in the room and started putting down towels, the happiness of getting to let out his wings had quickly been suppressed by the conversation he'd had earlier with Dream.
He would die in this tower. He was never leaving. He'd be in pain every day for the rest of his sad excuse of a life. It had been stupid of him to have hope for a better life in the first place. The boy knelt to the floor and chucked his shirt harshly onto the floor as angry tears filled his eyes. He gritted his teeth as his wings fell from his back, but the pain was quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming relief he felt as he spread out his vibrantly red wings. He felt some skin break as he stretched and quickly pressed his hand behind his back and onto the wound before he got blood all over the floor. Tommy winced as he felt the skin close up.
He looked down at his injured wrist from his altercation with Dream earlier. It was red and puffy, and while bruising hadn't set in yet, he was almost positive it would be an ugly purplish blue by tomorrow. That is, if he didn't heal it. He grimaced at it and let the golden powder fade away. Golden power? Wow. There wasn't a point in healing it, was there? It was just a bruise, and it was one he would proudly show off to Dream as his own form of rebellion. Clumped up feathers fell in droves from his wings that hadn't been properly preened in months, and Tommy sighed at the patchy bald spots where feathers should have grown in, but couldn't due to them always being in his back. He ran his fingers through his feathers as gently as he could, trying to preen the more rough-looking areas. Hopefully he had enough time to heal them a bit before Dream made him put them away. Enough time.
Well, he had all the time in the fucking world now. What is the point? Tommy whispered to himself, letting a loose feather fall from his hands and onto the floor. What is the point of any of this?
Oh, that's the end of the chapter! Oh my gosh!
I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah, you do.
I don't want to be the reason why.
He's sad, guys. He's sad.
Oh.
Sad
Oh,
lad.
baby.
Oh,
baby.
where did Chat go? Where's Chat? Chat is gone.
Okay, can I say my theory? Because I haven't read this.
Spill theory. Go.
My theory is that, okay, so like Chat is kind of like, okay, so you know how it's like streams, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my guess is that because Wilbur's not with his twin, the Chat's gonna follow him now.
Mm.
So then that's why they were like, you know what, Tech, we already know what you're doing. Bye-bye. So then they go with Wilbur.
They said, lol, bye-bye.
That was my assumption. I have no idea if it's right or wrong, so we'll see. Yeah.
This chapter is like one of my favorites.
Oh no.
For good reasons.
Okay.
Oh my gosh. All right, chapter 13. Lucky number 13.
Mm-hmm.
Awake my soul.
Wait, it's me.
It's you. Why am I speaking?
It's okay.
Go, bestie, go.
Chapter 13. Awake my soul. As the late afternoon sun peered through the leaves, the prince took a deep breath. The crisp, chill air of the dying embers of winter filled his lungs and he sighed, relieved he'd decided to do this after all. He gently ran his fingers over the ridge where Ossium's mane would be as they tracked through the woods. Ossium was Quackity's horse that he'd let him borrow for his outing in the woods. After all, he couldn't take Carl from the stables. His brother would murder him for touching his prized stallion.
Carl.
The horse whinnied at the touch, and Wilbur smiled as he trailed into a less dense part of the forest where the sun shone down warmly upon them. He was glad he'd decided to bring his trench coat. The nights in Lamamber got rather chilly. The brunette tucked his beanie more snugly over his ears and allowed Ossium to slow to a steady walk. He'd been out here maybe a few hours, traveling deeper and deeper into the woods, relishing in the fact that he had no idea where he was now.
Good. Or wait, wow. Good and lost. Perfect. He'd eventually figure his way out, and Wilbur knew how to keep himself alive for a while if he found himself truly lost. With each step, Wilbur felt the tension ebb away until finally he felt truly and totally alone, and far, far away from the castle and the memories that lay within. At some point in his trek, when the sun began to dip below the horizon, he found himself singing to whatever wildlife would hear him. How fickle my heart and how woozy my eyes.
I struggle to find any truth in your lies, and now my heart stumbles on things I don't know. My weakness I feel I must finally show. Lend me your hand, and we'll conquer them all.
But lend me your heart, and I'll just let you fall. Lend me your eyes, and I can change what you see. But your soul you must keep totally free. Awake, my soul.
Awake, my soul. That's a new one. When did you write that? An uncharacteristic squeal left Wilbur at the voice, and he nearly fell off Ossium. His head whipped around to the source, and he let out a sigh. Techno.
In the flesh, his twin grinned, reining in his own horse so it trotted next to Wilbur's. The man was no longer wearing the somber morning clothes he had on this morning, and instead changed into a more casual riding outfit like his own. The brunette shook his head, perplexed. How the hell did you find me? His brother quirked his head. Are you really that surprised? If I can track down a wolf 50 miles away from home, then I can certainly track you, Wilbur. Humph, Wilbur scoffed, looking away for a moment before speaking. Don't bother trying to bring me home. I won't go.
I know. Brunette's head shot up at that. He sputtered. You're not going to stop me? I mean, if it gets to the point that we've been out here 2 weeks, then maybe. But I understand why you're doing this, Wilbur. Techno looked down at the forest floor, his voice suddenly sad. I just wish you trusted that I would have gone with you without question. Wilbur's hand shot to his brother's shoulder. It's not that. I promise. I know you think you know the reason I'm out here, but it's not like that at all. Had everything gone normally, I would have gone to the memorial.
The horses continued their trek through the woods, with the two princes riding side by side as Techno asked, Then why? What happened? Wilbur's eyes glazed over for a moment, and Techno felt his heart begin to harden as he prepared for whatever blow his brother was about to deliver. His brother sighed and spoke solemnly. Phil, Dad, told me something new about the night we lost him. The brunette looked at Techno with a pained expression, and Techno felt his stomach twist with anxiety. Wilbur lowered his hand and lamented. Dad knew Theseus was in danger and didn't tell us. He's known for years.
Techno stared at his brother as the words hung precariously in the air. His hands dropped from Will's shoulder and swung uselessly at his side as what Wilbur said sunk in. No, that doesn't make any sense. Why would he... What? Techno croaked, and then winced when his voice wobbled on the word. His twin bit his lip as he spoke, as if just talking about it was like a knife to the gut. I went out to let him know the ceremony would be starting soon, and I found him out by Theseus's grave. The conversation went fine until I told him it wasn't his fault we lost our brother.
Wilbur sucked in a breath. The look he gave me, Tech. I've never seen him look so vulnerable until that moment. That wasn't true. There was only one other time in his life when he'd seen his father look that way. His cries echoed throughout the room as he pulled himself onto his elbows, his ribs screaming at the movement. He managed to crawl his way from the corner of the room and panicked when he saw his twin's unconscious figure. Schlatt knelt at Technoblade's side, examining the prince's head for any signs of a bleed. Wilbur couldn't help but notice the arrow embedded into Schlatt's shoulder, freely bleeding, but the man didn't seem to care.
Wilbur, a voice called, and the prince turned to see his father lying in the doorway, a dark stain soaking through his yukata. Wilbur's eyes widened in fear as he frantically began crawling towards his father, and then cried out in pain as a loud cracking sound echoed throughout the room. Don't move, your highness. Oh shit, that was Schlatt.
British Schlatt isn't real. British Schlatt can't hurt you.
Don't move, your highness, Schlatt called out, but Wilbur ignored him and continued crawling towards Phil until he was able to reach out and wrap his tiny hand around his. He turned his head up and saw his father staring back at him with an expression that would haunt him to the end of his days. In his father's eyes, he saw weakness, and it shook Wilbur to his very core. Wilbur sighed as the memory faded from his mind. He looked over to his brother and said, I think he wanted me to know. He just didn't want to have to deal with the knowledge alone anymore. He rubbed his eyes with his hands as he spoke. Phil told me he had gotten a vision of Theseus telling him he was in danger years before any of us were born. Well, that's vague. How would he have known when it would happen? Techno defended. Sure, it still felt like a mild sting of betrayal, but that was something forgivable. They had been children.
I don't know. I think in a vision, Theseus was around the same time he was when he was taken. But he also said Theseus talked about the masked man to him that night. Now that made Techno's back stiffen, and Carl whined at the movement, clearly sensing his rider's distress. He knew about the masked man? Wilbur nodded, his eyes dark. Techno tried to swallow back rage as best he could, but it was much harder to manage his emotions without chat.
Did he know he would take him? Techno's voice was low as he tried to keep it from shaking. Wilbur looked up the sky, clouded by tree leaves, and responded softly. I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think he knew what would happen. But it doesn't excuse the fact that you're upset because he didn't tell us about the man. Techno cuts him off. His voice was suddenly hauntingly calm. He was mad, sure. Furious, even, but what his father had done wasn't done maliciously. He hadn't told them because he wanted them to grow up without that fear looming over their heads. It was just heartbreaking that by protecting Wilbur and him, Phil had failed to protect Theseus. Wilbur turned his head up at him and furrowed his brows. And you're not?
Of course I am, Wilbur. But our father is human. He makes mistakes. He thought he was protecting us by not telling us about his visions. That's a lot to put on two 11-year-olds. But we could have saved him, Wilbur argued, his voice distressed. Technoblade simply nodded. You're right. We could have saved him. We could have done a lot of things differently. But there's no point in turning against each other when we are all each other has left. Phil paid for his mistake that night, twice over. He's already lost his youngest son and his wife, Techno said, squeezing his shoulder. He can't lose you too, Wilbur. Wilbur's gaze dropped to the forest floor in shame. I told him I hated him earlier. I didn't mean it, but I said it all the same. His twin raised an eyebrow at him, but the brunette continued. I need time. Time to sort everything out. He won't lose me, but I can't face him today. Not after what happened.
Techno nodded and looked ahead at the forest in front of them, taking in the lay of the land. No, we won't. We'll camp somewhere around here tonight, and tomorrow you can decide what you want to do. But I'm not leaving you out here alone. Wilbur scoffed, but Techno could see the sadness drain away from his expression as the atmosphere cleared. The brunette turned to him with a frown and said sourly, I can handle myself just fine. A dry laugh exited Techno, and the man side-eyed him before saying sarcastically, Uh-huh. Sure. I can, you dick, Wilbur protested, suddenly leaning his weight forward in his saddle before clicking his tongue. And just like that, Ossium was off, leaving Techno in the dust.
The man smirked as he watched his brother's futile attempt to escape his company. He leaned forward and gently ruffled Carl's mane before saying gently, Up for a bit of a race, Carl? I got a few golden carrots in my satchel with your name on them. Carl neighed happily, and Techno grinned before turning his gaze to his brother, who grew smaller and smaller as he galloped away into the distant trees. He signaled Carl into a run and muttered to himself over the wind. He never learns, does he? Nobody can outrun me for long. And as the two boys raced through the forest, unbeknownst to both of them, a bird was trailing not far behind them. Twins do well.
The morning dawn peered through the windows of the tower and on into the eyes of a certain blonde-headed boy, causing him to groan and bury himself further underneath his covers. He blearily let his eyes flutter open when he felt a small weight land atop his shoulder. He gently peeled back the covers and smiled when a bird poked her beak into his cheek. "Ow!" Tommy mumbled half-heartedly, and lifted his hand up for Crow to perch on. "How are you this morning, Crow? Hope you had a better night than I did." Crow chirped sadly, quirking her head to the side. Tommy's eyes glazed over for a moment as he recalled the events of the night before. As if on cue, he felt his wings attempt to stretch uncomfortably in his spine.
Tommy sighed. He hadn't given them enough time to heal last night. Little to none, if he was being honest. He'd been so distraught over everything that the boy hadn't seen much of a point. And now he was paying for it. Maybe if I took them out once Dream left? No, he'd still find out somehow. It's too risky. Tommy looked down at Crow with sad eyes and said, "I wish you could stay here longer, buddy. But Dream is home today and I have some chores to do before he leaves. I'll see you around 9. He should be long gone by then."
Rose squawked affirmatively and nuzzled her head into the boy's cheek once before flying off. Once she cleared the hatch, Tommy threw off the rest of his blankets and walked sluggishly to his wardrobe. He traded out his nightshirt and pants for a long-sleeved blue shirt and a pair of brown trousers. And as the early morning spring air wafted through the room, Tommy threw on a red scarf for good measure before tromping down the stairs to start his morning chores. It didn't take him too long, but he maybe finished 15 minutes past 7. He set the frying pan he'd used when helping Dream cook dinner last night to the side, along with the other dishes, allowing them to dry on the counter. Afterward, he'd settled on the living room couch with a book in his hand as he waited for his brother to wake up.
Sweep again, and by then it's like 7:15. As he flipped impassively through one of the books he'd read maybe 1,000 times, Dream appeared from his bedroom, already dressed in his hood. Tommy pretended not to see him as he made his way towards the couch. Dream sat at the end of the sofa and Tommy caught him fiddling with his hands, an uncharacteristically nervous gesture on his part. The man cleared his throat before speaking. "You still mad?" "What do you think?" Tommy growled with a tone that surprised even himself. Usually Tommy wouldn't dare to speak to Dream in such a way, but now that he had nothing more to lose, he didn't really care anymore. Consequences be damned. To his shock, Dream only dropped his head and said softly, "I'm sorry, Tommy, but it's for your own good. I'm only doing what I think is best for you."
At that, Tommy clapped his book shut, his eyes suddenly aflame. "And what makes you think you know what is best for me?" Dream's head snapped up, and he glowered. "I saved you. I raised you myself. I witnessed every milestone you've ever taken. I know what's best for you." Tommy stayed quiet, his seething response getting hot on his tongue, ready to fire. His brother sighed, dropping his head. "Tommy, look at me." Reluctantly, Tommy's eyes flickered to his, too fearful to deny his order. Dream's eyes were soft as he spoke. "When I get back from my trip, things will be different, I promise. You just need to trust me." The funny thing was, Tommy wasn't sure if he could anymore, but he nodded anyway.
Dream smiled and pulled the boy to his feet. He placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll bring you back something special for your birthday, alright?" Tommy nodded, but his eyes were still glued to the floor. Dream tilted his chin up and said gently, "I'll be better, Tommy. I swear, just be patient. I'll see you in a couple of days, okay?" Finally, the boy yielded and looked up at his brother. He gave him a small smile and affirmed, "Okay, I'll trust you." The dirty blonde ruffled his hair and pulled the teen into a hug. "I love you, little brother." "Do you?"
Tommy rolled his eyes as he responded to the gimmick they'd been doing for years. "I love you more." "Do I? I love you most." Tommy didn't know if that was true anymore.
Brother knows best. Twins duo. Wilbur awoke that morning to the feeling of a heavy bag being dropped on his chest, along with a breakfast bar. Yum!
Yeah.
Along with a breakfast bar being tossed at his head not 2 seconds later. The brunette groaned at the impact and sat up grouchily to see his brother smirking at him. Wake up, Sleeping Beauty. The sun is up. Wilbur fell dramatically backward onto the forest floor and huffed. Bitch! I knew I should have actually tried to outrun you. As if you could outrun Carl. Techno chuckled and brushed his long, unbraided hair out of his face as he held up a carrot for Carl to munch on.
True, Wilbur mumbled as he shoved the breakfast bar into his mouth while tugging his coat on. Ossium gently nudged the back of Wilbur's head, and he smiled before reaching into Techno's satchel to grab a carrot for him. Here you go, boy. Ossium neighed back appreciatively and trotted back over to Carl's side. Meanwhile, Techno had moved back to sit on his own makeshift bed and attempted to pull his hair into a poor excuse of a braid. Wilbur scoffed and moved behind him, batting his hands away. Let me. You always manage to get it even more knotted when you try to braid it. Are you ever going to learn how to actually braid it?
Techno grinned. Why should I? I have you to do it for me. Wilbur rolled his eyes and thumped the back of his head before wrangling his brother's hair into a long French braid that showed off the shaven sides of his head. Wilbur frowned, a memory bubbling up as he finished tying up the braid. Dude, you look like... Wilbur had trailed off the day that he first saw his brother's new haircut, the insult on the tip of his tongue. Technoblade raised an eyebrow, almost as a challenge, daring him to finish the sentence. Oh, he's 20 in this? I made him sound like a kid. Wow. Then the 20-year-old prince knew exactly what he looked like. He looked like the warriors that had lived in their village. His hairstyle was a traditional side shave worn by any piglin brutes who had hair, which not many did.
Wilbur's eyes darkened at the sight, but he bit his tongue and let the rest of his sentence die in his throat. Techno sighed. We both deal with what happens to us in different ways. Let's leave it at that. If I can live with your hair color, then you can live with this. Wilbur didn't respond, but rather nodded instead, reaching over to squeeze his twin's shoulder. And then his eyes glinted mischievously. You still look like a nerd. You still look like a prick.
No, they traded insults. I'm unwell. Wilbur moved to the side and noticed his brother fiddling with something in his satchel. His eyes widened as he took in the side of the contraption. You brought our elytras? He asked, and Techno nodded as he threaded a thick piece of wire through one of the loops, cinching one piece to another. I figured it couldn't hurt to get some practice. Besides, I promised Tubbo I'd take it out for another test run at some point. Yours is in the bag. Wilbur grinned and eagerly snatched his bag up from his makeshift bed, giddy as he ran his fingers delicately over the blue leather. Tubbo's invention was truly something to admire. The two princes were the first to have gotten to try it out a few weeks back, though they had nearly spiraled into the ground, as they hadn't been sure how to balance themselves.
But after a few tries, they were getting decent. The elytra itself wasn't exactly a wing, per se, and they couldn't fly with it. But they could glide. It was a temporary solution until Tubbo figured out how to get the elytra to flap in synchronization with Wilbur's other wing. He had a few ideas, but they were still in early development. But for now, they essentially could fly by gliding off of cliffs and towers, nearly giving their father a heart attack on multiple occasions.
Awesome. But we should send Ossium and Carl home if we're going to use these. Otherwise, they won't be able to keep up. Wilbur pointed out, and Techno frowned before nodding. Yeah, you're right. Besides, we don't exactly have enough to feed them as of now, so we should go on foot from here on out. Techno stood and gently brushed Carl's snout. Hear that, boy? Make sure to get Ossium back to Quackity, all right? Thank you for getting us out this far, Techno said in an uncharacteristically gentle voice that he only ever used for Carl. Wilbur patted Ossium on the nose affectionately to say goodbye, and then smiled as he watched the two horses take off, already heading back into the direction of the castle. He knew nobody would dare be foolish enough to try to take Carl, which meant Ossium would be safe in his company.
Once the horses had cleared out, The twins began to take down the camp they had set up the night before. Wilbur stamped out any leftover embers from their campfire, not wanting to risk a fire breaking out due to their carelessness. As soon as they destroyed any evidence of a camp, they packed up their gear and were just about to start moving when Wilbur felt something poke at him when he placed his canteen back into his satchel. His fingers wrapped around a metal chain, and his expression faltered as he pulled out Theseus's necklace.
Aww.
Techno turned to see what the holdup was, and frowned. You sure it was a good idea to bring that? Wilbur held it up, letting the emerald dangle in front of his face. He smiled sadly. I never go anywhere without it. Felt wrong to leave it behind.
Just as he was about to place the necklace back into his satchel, like a divine intervention from the sky, a bird swooped down as fast as an arrow and snatched Theseus's necklace from his hand. Shit! Techno yelled and immediately took off after what looked like a raven. He briefly turned back to yell at Wilbur, who was still in shock. Dude, move your ass before it gets away! The brunette shook himself out from the shock and sprinted off as well. The two boys ran through the forest as if their lives depended on it, desperately hoping the bird wouldn't drop the last remnant they had of their little brother.
Did I shoot it down? Wilbur yelled, already loading an arrow into his crossbow. Techno shook his head. You can't, that's a crow. Who the hell cares if it's a crow? It's getting away, Wilbur argued, aiming his bow to the sky, turning to line up his sight. But before he could let the arrow fly, Techno just about smacked the crossbow out of his hand mid-sprint. What the hell, man? Wilbur shouted angrily as he fumbled to not drop his crossbow or set it off.
Do not shoot that bird, Wilbur. Those were Mom's birds, and I won't let you kill it. We can catch it, Techno pleaded and sped up almost impossibly faster as he effortlessly jumped over the overgrown tree roots and fallen branches. Wilbur huffed and ripped the arrow out of its holster and shoved it back into his quiver. Fine. What's your oh-so-brilliant plan? Techno looked around at his surroundings, trying to see if he could gather where he was. If he remembered correctly, they were running in the exact direction of a cliff that led down to a part of the forest that was almost impossible to access. That was unless you traveled through the old mine shafts that had been built and then abandoned decades ago. It appeared that was exactly where the crow was headed.
Wilbur, Techno turned to his brother, nearly running into a tree as he took his eyes off the forest ahead of him for a split second. He could see already that his brother was getting tired, clearly not used to running this long. Techno fumbled to grab his elytra from his pack, careful not to let anything else fall as he attached it to his back. Wilbur took notice, and his face went pale. Are you fucking insane? Probably. Now put on your elytra, Wilbur. We're maybe about 200 yards from a cliff, and I'm not stopping. And just like that, Wilbur snatched his own elytra from his bag and clumsily put it on. The twins eventually had to slow down for a moment to secure the wings, but, funnily enough, the bird slowed down as well.
This is not how I plan to die, Techno! Wilbur shouted angrily when they took off again after securing their items. Techno grinned. Don't think about it. Just glide and try not to land on your head. Thanks, that makes me feel a lot better, the brunette hissed as his gaze darted up to the bird, who sped up and nose-dived down to what Wilbur's eyes appeared to be a death trap. He watched as Techno brought up his wing to mirror the elytra, but not enough that the wind would catch him before he could jump. Wilbur did the same, but not before yelling to his brother, "If we die, I'll kill you." Techno laughed. Get ready. Make sure to follow me down.
Wilbur muttered, and then sucked in a breath as the two jumped. And then, he was weightless. Wilbur spread out his wing and felt his elytra open, and suddenly all the fear he had vanished as he soared through the air. He pried his eyes open and let out a laugh as he was met with blue sky and the wind rushing through his hair. Phil was right. This is what it felt like to be truly free. Wilbur turned his gaze downward and saw his brother maybe 30 feet below him, and if he squinted, he could see the bird flying down towards the ground. So in order to keep up, Wilbur made a sharp descent down till he could get on the same level as Techno.
Once he was in range and the ground was maybe 150 feet below them, Techno called to his brother over the wind. Wilbur, do you see that? Techno pointed towards the east to a large mountain-like cliff that seemed to border a good chunk of the forest. Yeah, what about it? Wilbur called back, swooping to the side. There's a river traveling on top of that mountain, but I can't see where it ends. This means there's an opening, maybe a cavern of some kind in that mountain that either leads to a lake or a huge waterfall. If my suspicions are correct, the crow is making a direct beeline for it, Techno inferred. Wilbur was amazed that his twin was so well versed in geography.
We're running out of sky. Techno, we need to land, Wilbur warned, and Techno agreed and began making his descent, but never taking his eye off the bird who was already slowing down herself. As the two landed on the forest floor, with Wilbur nearly hitting a tree, the bird circled back towards them, before perching on a branch in a tall tree with the necklace still firmly clamped in her beak. It's like she's waiting for us, or something, Techno mused as he removed his elytra and tucked his wing back into his back. Wilbur laughed at that, as he shoved his elytra back into his satchel. It's just a bird, Techno. I'm sure it's just curious about us.
Techno didn't respond, and as soon as the two had put away their gear, the bird took off again. But this time she flew high and over the large cliff, disappearing into the cavern. Wilbur huffed. Well, that's just great. Now what? We follow it. If we can't find an entrance, then we'll just climb up and over. Techno looked up at the mountain as best he could through the trees. She went down, which means her nest is probably somewhere in there. Wilbur frowned, guilt churning in his gut. I'm sorry. I never should have brought it with me. It was stupid.
Don't worry. We'll find his necklace. Techno assured him, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. I hope so, Wilbur breathed. I don't know what I'll do if we lose it. Dream had left the tower nearly an hour ago, and Tommy had already fallen back to his normal routine of moping around the tower, bored out of his mind. He made himself breakfast to try and cheer himself up, but found himself stabbing his fork into his pancakes repeatedly until they were a mushy pile of maple syrup and batter. He shoved his breakfast to the side and just laid his head down on the table. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall down his face. Instead, he wiped them away and stood to his feet, not bothering to put his plate in the sink.
Pointless. He trudged up into his room and sat down at his piano bench. Tommy lifted up the lid and he let his fingers drift aimlessly across the keys. There was no melody, no specific song he was attempting to play. It was a mash of random notes that somehow still sounded decent to his ears. You are not leaving this tower. Ever. This was it. This was all he was ever going to be. Just some kid locked in a tower, left to rot. There was no longer any passion in his song. The notes fell flat and Tommy's finger kept hitting one specific key repeatedly. The same note echoed throughout Tommy's mind, as his hand remained stuck on the key, unable to move forward with the song.
How ironic. He would have been content to stay in that spot for a few hours if he hadn't heard Crow tap her beak against the hatch. Tommy looked up and tried to smile as he pulled the lever, letting Crow soar down to land on his shoulder. He greeted the bird, running his hand over her feathers. Tommy's eyes flitted downward, and he couldn't help but notice something glinting within her beak. He opened up his palm and raised an eyebrow when Crow dropped a golden necklace with an emerald pendant into his palm.
Oh? What's this? Tommy asked, lifting up the necklace to his face to look more closely at it. Something that had been dead and buried stirred in his chest at the sight of it, but he couldn't figure out why. It just felt right holding the necklace. He ran his thumb across the smooth face of the stone and then walked over to his mirror. The face that stared back at him was a tired one, and Tommy's eyes were still puffy, despite not allowing his sadness to spill over. He tried to ignore that as he pulled the chain over his head and let the pendant rest on his chest. As he looked at the boy in the mirror, the person staring back suddenly seemed like a stranger to him, like he belonged in a different world, a different life. He didn't know how to feel about such a revelation. It was just a necklace, perhaps one that Crow had found somewhere lost and forgotten in some alley.
Though there wasn't really any sign of age or wear on the necklace. No, it looked like it had been properly cared for. Where did you find this, Crow? Tommy asked, his voice soft. He held the emerald with his forefinger and thumb and twisted it back and forth. Familiar gesture for reasons Tommy could not yet begin to understand. Crow chirped innocently, and before he could ask her anything more, she flew off, leaving Tommy with only his reflection as company. After a few more minutes of staring, Tommy sighed and took off the necklace. He tucked it delicately into his little hiding spot inside his piano bench and went downstairs to finish the dishes.
Wilbur's hand brushed across the stone face of the cliff with a faraway look in his eye. He traced his finger over every bump and edge as they walked alongside the bottom of the cliffside, searching tirelessly for an entrance. He looked up into the nearby trees and nearly laughed at the sight of his twin leaping gracefully from limb to limb, carefully distributing his weight so as not to cause a branch to snap. The reason he was up there was to get a higher vantage point, but also to look around at the various bird nests in the trees, just in case they had been wrong about where the bird went. "See anything down there?" Techno called, hopping into another tree. The image of Techno jumping in trees is really making me smile right now. Wilbur shook his head. "Nothing but solid stone." "Well, keep it up. There has to be a way in," Techno replied, and Wilbur sighed but didn't argue.
He was about to ask how his search was going when all of a sudden there was a loud caw from somewhere not far from here that sent Technoblade scrambling down from his perch and Wilbur flying in the direction of the sound. The caw repeated again every so often as the twins raced through the forest, much like they had earlier. It's like this bird is trying to get us to find her. It didn't make any sense, but maybe Wilbur was simply reading too much into it. Finally, they come across an ivy-covered section of stone that had Techno grabbing his twin by the arm and pulling him to a stop. Wilbur watches his brother's trained eyes scan over it, looking for anything out of place. Wilbur squinted at the hanging veil of ivy, and something about it put him off as well. That feeling only doubled when he heard the crow call out again, but this time the noise stemmed from the rock. Wilbur walked to the veil and brushed his fingers over the leaves, and then he pushed his hand forward, expecting it to brush against the stone.
But it didn't, and Wilbur nearly fell as he stumbled into the veil of ivy and into a cave, or what he thought was a cave. He heard his brother gasp, and Wilbur looked up to see what was wrong. He had to admit, out of all the possibilities that ran through his mind about what lay inside the cavern, a lone, tall stone tower, sitting secluded from the rest of the world, wasn't exactly what he had pictured. "What the?" Wilbur mumbled, and Techno simply nodded, looking equally as confused. His twin helped him to his feet, and the two looked over at each other, unsure of what to do next. "Do you suppose it's abandoned?" Techno asked, as they walked towards the base of the tower, his eyes trained on the overgrown ivy wrapping around the tower. Then he looked at the huge waterfall behind that tower and smiled. He had been right on that account. Wilbur shrugged. "I mean, I think you'd have to be. Who on earth would want to live all the way out here? I mean, there is nothing in this area for miles."
"Which makes it a perfect nesting place for a bird," Techno suggested, and then grabbed 2 arrows from Wilbur's quiver. "What? You just gonna free climb it?" Wilbur asked incredulously. Techno responded to his question by plunging an arrow into a crevice between stones and began scaling the tower. "Hurry up, loser, before I beat you to the top." "Dude, I am not racing you while free climbing an 80-foot tower," Wilbur countered, rolling his eyes at Techno, who was already a good 20 feet in the air.
"Chicken!" Techno called, and Wilbur growled and pulled out 2 arrows of his own. "Competitive bastard!" He had no chance of beating his brother to the top, and grumbled as he saw Techno climb into the tower. He waited expectantly for his twin to gloat at him from the window while he scaled the rest of it. But he didn't. "Techno?" Wilbur called, nearly at the window. There was no response.
"Dude, stop fucking with me. If you scare me, I swear to Prime, I'll shave you bald in your sleep." Still nothing. Something wasn't right. Wilbur carefully pulled himself onto the ledge, but before he crawled inside, he waited, listening carefully for any sign of movement. It was subtle, the short panicked breath of someone just out of sight. It was much too high in pitch to be Techno's. Wilbur took a deep breath and leapt inside, landing on his feet. Immediately, he turned and caught the wrist of whoever had been hiding from him. The person yelped in pain, and the weapon in their hand clattered to the floor.
"Really? A frying pan?" Another hand shot out to swipe at him, and Wilbur hissed as the stranger smacked him across the face, causing him to release his hold on the stranger's wrist. The stranger was much smaller than he expected, and much too skinny. A child, maybe? He couldn't quite see him though, due to every other window in the house being covered, giving the stranger the advantage of knowing the tower's layout. He moved forward blindly in the dark and then stumbled to the ground as he tripped over what he guessed was his brother. He looked down and could vaguely make out Techno's unconscious body in the darkness. Wilbur waited for a moment until he was 100% sure his brother was breathing.
Wilbur looked for the frying pan that had most likely been the culprit that knocked out Techno, and froze when he saw it no longer on the floor. It was now in the hands of some stranger who was hiding somewhere in the tower, ready to pounce. He decided it was better to surrender before he too got whacked with the pan. All right, whoever you are, I surrender. There is no need for anyone else to get hurt, okay? He heard the quick steps of bare feet against the stone floor, and then a voice much too childlike to be that of an adult echoed throughout the room. Drop your weapons! Keep your hands where I can see them.
Well, I can't exactly do both at the same time, kid. Don't play dumb or you'll end up like Pinky over here. Wilbur growled at that, but unhooked his crossbow from his back and slid it across the room. He grabbed Techno's sword and his own dagger from its sheath and slid that over as well. With that, Wilbur raised his hands up as he crouched next to his brother's unconscious form. There. No more weapons. Now will you please stop hiding in the dark? I'm not going to hurt you.
Suddenly, a roll of duct tape was tossed at his head. Ow, Wilbur grumbled. Tie Pinky's hands, and then your own. Wilbur sighed. But he did what the kid said, after all. He was pretty sure whoever was in the shadows wouldn't kill him. Hopefully. It became apparent quickly once Wilbur had bound Techno's hands that it was really hard to tie his own. He looked into the darkness and lifted his hands. A little help? The voice stammered, and Wilbur's eyes softened at the fear in the kid's tone when they said, Just do the best you can, and don't try anything.
The best he could do was wrap the tape around once or twice before letting the roll hang, unable to cut it. Now will you come out? Wilbur huffed. He heard a couple of footsteps, and then the clicking sound of a latch as one of the windows opened. The brunette saw a flash of blonde before the kid darted back into the shadows. Trying to make a dramatic entrance? Oh, shut up! The kid growled, and then Wilbur saw the tip of the pan and one of the child's feet peek out as he nervously edged his way into the light.
Kid took a deep breath. A child no older than 14 or 15 appeared from the darkness. He was tall and scrawny, and Wilbur could already tell that he had terrible posture. The boy had long blonde hair that fell to his shoulders and bright blue eyes. The boy raised his frying pan menacingly into the air as he stepped closer to Wilbur and growled, Who are you, and how did you find me?